I'm watching there we go. Good morning and welcome to Bible study for Wednesday, March 31st. We're in Numbers chapter 34. We took a couple-week break because I was off on vacation, and then I had an important diocesan meeting after I came back from vacation on Wednesday. So let's just offer a recap of where we've been and where we're going. At the end of Numbers, there's again this renewal of the covenant. Every time that the Israelites have gone astray or walked away from God's plan for them, when it's time to come back and enter into a new phase, they get a reminder of what the covenant is, what does it mean to be in relationship with God, and what does God expect from them in return? So we've talked about the vows that people can take and the sacrifices that they will make to God in worship. And then we've been talking about the division of land and the expectation that God is not just giving them an empty land, but they are going into a land already inhabited. And they will need to conquer the land in order to be prosperous and inhabit the places that God has for them. So we have two tribes, Reuben and Gad, who said, hey, we really like this pasture land here before we cross over the Jordan. We want this land for our tribes. And Moses has said, well, as long as you promise to go in with all of your siblings in the Israelite community and help them to conquer the land, then yes, you can have this land. So they've set aside this land. They've built some fortified towns for their families and their flocks. And now the menfolk are going to go into the promised land across the Jordan with all the other tribes. And we had wrapped up chapter 33 with this warning from God. But if you fail to drive out the people who live in the land, those who remain will be like splinters in your eyes and thorns in your sides. They will harass you in the land where you live, and I will do to you what I had planned to do to them. So right from the beginning, the inception of Israel is one made in conquest. And the idea was for them to take total conquest, to drive the people out from the land and to conquer it completely. And the people do not do this. And so God has warned, they will be like splinters in your eyes. This is a hard part of our heritage to wrestle with. This idea that for some to succeed, others must be condemned and cast out. And it was something that the Israelites didn't deal with well either. They made alliances of convenience, and they didn't do this. And we've seen how hard it is to continue to keep peace in a land that is inhabited by people with differing values, with differing ways that they structure their society, and differing ideas of what is equitable and what is okay to do. And so this is a conflict that will carry over throughout the history of Israel. So now we go into chapter 34, and we're going to talk about the boundaries of the land. Then the Lord said to Moses, give these instructions to the Israelites. When you come into the land of Canaan, which I am giving to you as your special possession, these will be the boundaries. The southern portion of your country will extend from the wilderness of Zin along the edge of Edom. The southern boundary will begin on the east at the Dead Sea. It will then run past Scorpion Pass in the direction of Zin. In the southernmost point will be Kadesh Barnea, from which it will go to Hazar Adar and on to Asman. From Asman, the boundary will turn toward the brook of Egypt and the end of the Mediterranean Sea. You might have some other names there in your version. You might have had the mountains of Abarim, as far as Ebel Shittim, the Salt Sea, the ascent of Akrabim, and the Sea of Kinnereth. Again, these are names that were regional and colloquial, and we've done our best to describe them in a way that is meaningful for the modern reader today. but these would have been local geographic designations and places that have many names. So, moving on, the western boundary, verse 6, will be the coastline of the Mediterranean Sea. Your northern boundary will be at the Mediterranean Sea and run east to Mount Hor, then to Lebo Hamath, and on through Zedad and Ziphron to Hazar Enan. This will be your northern boundary. The eastern boundary will start at Hazar Enan and run south to Shephem, then down to Riblah and on to the east side of Ain. From there, the boundary will run down along the eastern edge of the Sea of Galilee, and then along the Jordan River to the Dead Sea. These are the boundaries of your land. Then Moses told the Israelites, this territory is the homeland you are to divide among yourselves by sacred lot. The Lord has commanded that the land be divided among the 9.5 remaining tribes. The families of the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh have already received their grants of land on the east side of the Jordan, across from the Jericho toward the sunrise. So they're going in with an idea of which land God has said to conquer. They haven't just said, well, we're going to build an empire and we're going to see how far we can go. No, there were boundaries given, that this land was their land. Also, in the history of conflict between Palestine and Israel and the religion of Islam and the religion of the Hebrew people and also Christianity, much fighting has occurred over this land, and whose land was it when? Again, Hebrews, Christians, and Muslims would trace their ancestry back through Abraham. And so there's this portion, remember early on in Genesis, where we hear God make a covenant and make a land of promise and talk about, if you will go into the land, I will give it to you and your ancestors forever. Well, we're still arguing about which are the rightful ancestors and who was driven out at what point, and therefore at what point was God with whom. So I just want to encourage you as we read these to contextualize that, to realize that this is a hotly contested, debated portion of Scripture of does this mean an imperial right forever to this land? And I would say no, and here's why. God says, if you do the things that I ask of you, I will remain faithful and you will remain in the land. The fact that the land has been conquered many times, the fact that the land remains contested, to me is an indication that God's promise is not a geographic, eternal promise, but one rooted in our relationship with God. But I'm a Christian, so I tend to value New Covenant as opposed to geographic. But Christians of all stripes, people of all stripes, take a different view on this sort of, does this land belong to Israel forever? When we read this, we are talking about it belonged to Israel then, and here's why. So, verse 16, and the Lord said to Moses, Eleazar the priest and Joshua son of Nun are the men designated to divide the grants of land among the people. Enlist one leader from each tribe to help them with the task. These are the tribes and the names of the leaders. Judah was led by Caleb son of Jephunneh. Simeon led by Shemuel son of Ammihud. Benjamin led by Eldad, son of Kislon. Dan, led by Buki, son of Jogli. Manasseh, son of Joseph, led by Haniel, son of Ephod. Ephraim, son of Joseph, led by Kemuel, son of Shiftan. Zebulun, led by Elizaphan, son of Parnach. Issachar, led by Paltiel, son of Azan. Asher, led by Ahud, son of Shelomi. Naphtali, led by Pedahel, son of Ammihud. These are the men the Lord has appointed to divide the grants of land in Canaan among the Israelites. Now we have towns for the Levites. Remember, Israel is a largely shepherd, nomadic kind of society with some edges of agrarian, meaning they needed large tracts of land to support these various tribes. But the Levites didn't have time to devote their time to shepherding and to farming because they were tasked with keeping together the temple and temple worship and assisting with all of that. And so there was the promise that towns would be set aside for these people and tithes would be given from the other tribes to support the Levites and their work. So while Israel was camped beside the Jordan on the plains of Moab across from Jericho, the Lord said to Moses, "Command the people of Israel to give to the Levites from their property certain towns to live in, along with surrounding pasture lands. These towns will be for the Levites to live in, and the surrounding lands will provide pasture for their cattle, flocks, and other livestock. The pasture land assigned to the Levites around these towns will extend 1,500 feet from the town walls in every direction. Measure off 3,000 feet outside the town walls in every direction, east, south, west, north, with town at the center. This area will serve as a larger pasture land for the towns. 6 of the towns you give the Levites will be cities of refuge, where a person who has accidentally killed someone can flee for safety. In addition, give them 42 other towns." So remember, there are sanctuary rules where if you kill someone by accident, you can flee and take refuge with the Levites until your case has been heard. These 6 towns are for that. But in all, 48 towns with the surrounding pasture land will be given to the Levites. These towns will come from the property of the people of Israel. The larger tribes will give more towns to the Levites, while the smaller tribes will give fewer. Each tribe will give property in proportion to the size of its land. So again, we have this idea set out from the start that the amount of land you're getting is proportion to the population, and then the amount that you are expected to give from what you have been given is kept in proportion as well. So the Israelite society is set up, ideally, from the beginning, with not only a measure of equality, but also a measure of fairness and of provision. Because remember, we're not just setting up a society based on principles or ideals. We're setting this society up based on God's love for the people and a genuine desire for them to be cared for and to have their needs met. And so God is saying, here's how this happens. And we're going to place boundaries and limits, because what happens in human nature? Selfishness. And we have a tendency to want the best things and the most things for ourselves. And then we give out of what's left over and we go, I'll share that. That's not what God says. God says, no, we're going to create a fair society with places of refuge and with places of care being given. All right, so going back to these cities, verse 16, "But if someone strikes and kills another person with a piece of iron, it is murder, and the murderer must be executed." Oh, wait, sorry, I skipped a verse. We're at the cities of refuge. Okay, verse 9, "The Lord said to Moses, give the following instructions to the people of Israel. When you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, designate cities of refuge where people can flee if they have killed someone accidentally. These cities will be places of protection from a dead person's relatives who want to avenge the death. The slayer must not be put to death before being tried by the community. Designate 6 cities of refuge for yourself, 3 on the east side of the Jordan and 3 on the west in the land of Canaan. These cities are for the protection of Israelites, foreigners living among you, and traveling merchants. Anyone who accidentally kills someone may flee there for their safety." So foreigner or citizen alike had a right to fair and due process within the Israelite community. And so in order for there to be protection, They made a fairly equal distribution of these towns of sanctuary so that people could go and have their case heard. But God places some limits on this. Jesus also places limits, and it's important for us as Christians to remember that we're not expected to just always be nice and merciful. We're also expected to take into account God's justice. Verse 16 goes into that. If someone strikes and kills another person with a piece of iron, it is murder, and the murderer must be executed. Or if someone with a stone in his hand strikes and kills another person, it is murder, and the person must be put to death. Or if someone strikes and kills another person with a wooden object, it is murder, and the murderer must be put to death. The victim's nearest relative is responsible for putting the murderer to death. When they meet, the avenger must put the murderer to death. So if someone hates another person and waits in ambush, then pushes him or throws something at him and he dies, it is murder. Or if someone hates another person and hits him with a fist and he dies, it is murder. In such cases, the avenger must put the murderer to death when they meet. So murder talks about intent. So murder talks about this idea that you wanted to kill that person. Or, because we've just heard about intent with your hatred, or if you use something or do something that there's a very reasonable probability someone will die from, it doesn't matter if you weren't really trying to kill them, it was murder. So God says striking someone with a piece of iron, striking someone with a stone, and striking something with a heavy wooden object, there's a reasonable belief you're going to kill someone. And if you're going to do that, you murdered them. This is a little controversial, but right now there is a trial going on for Derek Chauvin, who knelt for 8 minutes on a black man named George Floyd. And he died. I'm not part of that trial, but I will say, if you kneel on someone's neck for 8 minutes, you should know they're probably going to die. And therefore, I join my voice in a call for justice that we have got to hold people accountable, even when they are our police, and especially when they are our police, that there are ways to pacify that do not result in people dying. This is not one of them, and it's not okay. And it honestly doesn't matter what the person had done or left undone in the moments leading up to this encounter, because there's a reasonable expectation that this will result in death. And God doesn't want us to murder people. People should live to be judged. And so that's just my tangent. Sorry, we'll go back to, what does God say about murder? Well, God says it's not always murder. Verse 22, but suppose someone pushes another person without having shown previous hostility, or throws something that unintentionally hits another person, or accidentally drops a huge stone on someone, though they were not enemies, and the person dies. If this should happen, the community must follow these regulations in making a judgment between the slayer and the avenger, the victim's nearest relative. The community must protect the slayer from the avenger and must escort the slayer back to live in the city of refuge to which he fled. There he must remain until the death of the high priest who is anointed with the sacred oil. But if the slayer ever leaves the limits of the city of refuge and the avenger finds him outside the city and kills him, it will not be considered murder. The slayer should have stayed inside the city of refuge until the death of the high priest. But after the death of the high priest, the slayer may return to his own property. These are legal requirements for you to observe from generation to generation, wherever you may live. So let's break that down. What did that mean? It meant that if I accidentally, let's say I was cleaning from an upper window and my chamber pot fell out struck you on the head, and you died. I could run to my city of refuge, explain what had happened. The people of the city of refuge would meet as intermediaries with me and my avenger, the person who is the nearest closest relative of the person who died, and would say, here's what we are going to do. This person is going to live in this city until the death of the high priest, and then they would escort them back in safety to the city, and there they would remain. Why? There's still a high value on human life. You shouldn't just be able to say, oops, it was an accident, I'm sorry, and go about your regular daily routine. In order to be protected from being avenged and therefore being killed yourself, having killed, you had to uproot your life. You had to go live in the city of refuge, and you made atonement with time. You lived there until the high priest died. Now, depending on how old the high priest was, might be a long while. But this idea that there is a sacred value to human life, and you don't just get to say, I didn't mean it. It was an accident. Because you were negligent. And there is a consequence to that, but the consequence isn't your own death in this case. But let's say you got tired of waiting. It's been several years. You think surely they've cooled off by now, and you move back home. You've dishonored the life that you took. You've said, well, my life is more important than the life that was lost, and I just want to get back to normal. And the avenger has every right to say, how dare you? How dare you say that you've paid the price? You have not. And they can kill you. And that was allowed and just. Now, we are Christians. We don't follow these laws. These were the laws given in this time as a way to mediate lawlessness and endless cycles of revenge taking. So, what happens next? Verse 30. All murderers must be put to death, but only if evidence is presented by more than one witness. No one may be put to death on the testimony of only one witness. Wait, God knows that people might lie? Yes. And God knows that people might say, I really like their land. I think they did it on purpose. Or they exaggerate. Yeah, it wasn't just a fist. He picked up this big, heavy stick and bashed him. We want 2 or 3 witnesses to hold people account because, again, all lives have sacred value. Both those who have taken a life and those whose lives were taken. And keeping that in balance and proportion is something that God emphasizes. That's why we have trials. Verse 31, also you must never accept a ransom payment for the life of someone judged guilty of murder and subject to execution. You can't buy your way into saying, oh, my bad. Not in God's eyes. In the society that God created, God, again, there's no price you can pay to say, it's all good now. Murderers must always be put to death, and never accept a ransom payment from someone who has fled to a city of refuge, allowing a slayer to return to his property before the death of the high priest. So you can't pay your way out of the length of your punishment. And this will ensure that the land where you live will not be polluted, for murder pollutes the land. Murder pollutes the land. This is true, and something that we still reckon with today, that we, although we are not Israelites, we live in a land that has had generations of murder. Regardless of your age, your gender, your anything, all of us have been profoundly affected by institutions of slavery that perpetuated murder and the bodies of people. We all in this land, those of us who are not Native First Peoples, have benefited from genocides and intentional delivery of smallpox blankets to expand our possession of the land. Our land is polluted. And we need to take that into account. And no sacrifice except the execution of the murderer can purify the land from murder. Now, this has an asterisk at it that says, or make atonement for murder. Basically, there is nothing that we can do that is going to cleanse our land. But the good news that we have as followers of Christ is that we have a whole account of Scripture. And so we also have the words that say, but if they will humble themselves before the Lord and repent and kneel, the Lord will heal their land. So while we cannot do anything to heal our land, God can. And the first step in that process is for us to humble ourselves as a people and as a country and say, here's where we've messed up. And God, we're asking you to help us to heal. And so I pray that, especially this week, you will continue to pray for God to help heal our land. You must not defile the land where you live, for I live there myself. I am the Lord who lives among the people of Israel. This idea that our home is not just ours, but is God's. God made this place as a place to be united with the people and wants to be with us, wants to hang out with us, and wants to spend time with us, but we've made it inhospitable. Now, chapter 36, one of my favorite chapters of the Bible, women who inherit property. Because despite many, many, many generations where we've looked at the faith as being misogynistic or overly identified with maleness, God isn't so one-sided on that. Then the heads of the clans of Gilead, descendants of Machir, son of Manasseh, son of Joseph, came to Moses and the family leaders of Israel with a petition. They said, Sir, the Lord instructed you to divide the land by sacred lot amongst the people of Israel. You were told by the Lord to give the grant of land owned by our brother Zelophehad to his daughters. But if they marry men from another tribe, their grants of land will go with them to the tribe into which they marry. In this way, the total area of our tribal land will be reduced. Then when the year of Jubilee comes, their portion of the land will be added to that of the new tribe, causing it to be lost forever to our ancestral tribe. So Moses gave the Israelites this command from the Lord. The claim of the men of the tribe of Joseph is legitimate. This is what the Lord commands concerning the daughters of Zelophehad. Let them marry anyone they like, as long as it is within their own ancestral tribe. None of the territorial land may pass from tribe to tribe, for all the land given to each tribe must remain within the tribe to which it was first allotted. The daughters throughout the tribes of Israel who are in line to inherit property must marry within their tribe, so that all the Israelites will keep their ancestral property. No grant of land may pass from one tribe to another. Each tribe of Israel must keep its allotted portion of land. So we have in here this sort of complex thing that is a protection of women, but also a limitation of women. So these daughters inherit equal property rights as if they were sons, and no one can take that from them. But they now must marry within their ancestral tribe in order to not complicate and change who the land belongs to in the long term. And so they must marry within their tribe to keep that land within. But notice it doesn't say who they have to marry within that distinction. And why is this a protection as well as a limitation? It's a protection because women were not women who had inherited were not free market pawns in order to gain more. You couldn't go, oh, hey, baby, I like that plot of land you got. Come marry into my tribe. This was not allowed. Women within the Israelite community were still subject to being bargaining chips, still subject to being transfers from father to their husband, but they couldn't be used in this sort of property scheme of enlarging an empire. So there was protection in that. And we hear next what happens to these daughters. The daughters of Zelophehad did as the Lord commanded Moses. Mala, Tisra, Hogla, Milcah, and Noah all married cousins on their father's side. They married into the clans of Manasseh, son of Joseph. Thus, their inheritance of land remained with their ancestral tribe. So they choose to marry into some distant cousins on their father's side, and they keep the land. These are the commands and regulations that the Lord gave to the people of Israel through Moses while they were camped on the plains of Moab beside the Jordan River across from Jericho. So we have finished up Numbers. Remember, Numbers started with a census and it ends with a census, as they've spent about 50 years in the promise, in the journey back through the wilderness after they refused to enter the promised land the first time. And now we're going to go into Deuteronomy, where Moses is going to give a final address to the people before them going into the promised land. And it's a repeat with re-emphasis, meaning it's going to take us through a lot of the same territory we've traveled in Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers, but there's an added layer of theological interpretation. Moses, after living a life of leadership amongst these people, is going to offer some emphasis of not just here's what to do when, but also why. And why did this happen? And why did we come here? And then how can we move forward together as a community, even though I will be leaving you? Because remember, Moses whacked on that rock out in the out in the field, rather than just saying, the Lord will give you the water. And God punishes him for his need to show his own power and strength in that moment and says, you're not going to enter the promised land either. So Moses writes in Deuteronomy this sort of final letter, this final encouragement to the people of, here's what could happen. Here's what I hope with God happens. Here's what will happen when you're not obedient. And may God be with you on the journey. So Deuteronomy is the final book of the Pentateuch, and we're going to open it up next week. So we're going to stop here with Numbers and take some time to sort of review what has happened and offer you a chance to ask some questions that you might have. So I'm going to go ahead and end the recording here. And I know it's a little early, but nobody minds. I hope we're going to keep this clean so we can start with Deuteronomy fresh after Easter. All right, stopping the recording.